Hi, this is Rishabh Rajan, and this is a review of the Behringer 2600. So it's finally here, the 8U version recreation of the classic ARP 2600. So in terms of the design here, you can expect all the same controls as the original had, except there aren't any built-in speakers, and the spring reverb is a digital emulation. Behringer has brought this synth into the 21st century by adding MIDI control via 5-pin as well as USB. There's also a dedicated LFO, Portamento, and envelope scaling options that the original didn't have. At the back of the unit, you can see the 5-pin MIDI in and through ports, as well as the USB port. This is just for MIDI, and even the MIDI implementation is quite basic. It just does note on and off. There are a couple of foot switch jacks here for Portamento control, as well as an interval latch option when used in Duo mode. Yes, there is a Duo mode where you can play two notes, and two of the oscillators will produce those separate notes. So it's nice to see that Behringer has tried to improve on the original design a little bit, or at least give us some additional features. Alright, let's now take a deep dive into the synth and check out some of its controls. Now, the first thing I want to talk about are the lights that you see here. If you're not a fan of RGB LED lights, you can dim them with the knob at the back. So I can bring it all the way down, and now all the LEDs are off, except for a couple at the bottom over here. LFO speed, for some reason, the LED is still on. So yes, we get an additional LFO on this 2600, which the original did not have. On the right here, the sample and hold rate also has the LED on, and this electronic switch also has the LEDs running. And of course, the power LED is also on. Alright, I'm going to bring the LEDs back up. So I like that it's a dimmer, so it does not have to be all the way up at full brightness. You can kind of leave it halfway through. This is at the maximum brightness. I'm going to tone it down a little bit. And let's keep it somewhere around here. Alright, let's now talk about the sound of the synthesizer. So very similar to the original ARP 2600, but there are some things that are unique to this synthesizer that are not from the original ARP 2600. And you will see that that makes it slightly more usable, or at least a bit more feature-rich. There is a duo voice mode here, so you can switch to duo mode and then play two notes simultaneously. There are 4 waveform outputs on Oscillator 2 and Oscillator 3. On the original, Oscillator 3 only had 2 outputs. There's a switch on the filter that lets you switch between the original ladder filter design or the regular version that was more popular on the original units. They are both low-pass filters, and they do sound very similar, but we'll have a listen to it and you can judge for yourself. The original ARP 2600 comes with a voltage control keyboard. This synth uses MIDI, but now the sliders can be MIDI controlled, though you still have the option to use voltage control instead. Alright, so let's listen to the oscillators. We'll start with VCO1 here. We'll skip the filter, so I'll just take the direct output of the pulse waveform here and plug it into the VCA. You can see here we have the voltage controlled amplifier section, and I can patch in any signal in here and override the normal connection. So now this pulse wave is going to the VCA on this slider. I'm not going to play this with a MIDI controller yet. I'll just increase this initial gain control on the VCA so we can just hear a drone of the oscillator. That's at the lowest, and that's at its highest. There's a fine-tune control. Pulse width, we are listening to the pulse waveform. It does not go all the way to the lowest or the highest, so the sound is not completely cut off on the ends. Let's check out the sawtooth waveform. Pulse width won't work, fine-tune works, and we have the same frequency control. We're currently at audio rate, but I can switch this down to low frequency rate, so it's essentially a low frequency oscillator now. So at its highest, we just hear some clicks. Same for the pulse. Alright, so that's just the oscillator by itself. I'll bring the initial gain down. Let's now combine all 3 oscillators, run it through the filter, and have a listen to that. Right now the filter is receiving the signal from VCO1 on this input here, and we have it on this slider. Second VCO over here, and VCO3 over here. If I increase the initial gain again, now the 3 oscillators are not quite in tune together, but there is sync available on Oscillator 2 and Oscillator 3. So just turning that on, aside from just getting the classic hard sync sound, we can also kind of get all 3 oscillators in tune with each other. Now the drawback of sync is that we don't get that detuning effect that's very common with classic analog synths. So let's turn off sync and let's tune these. So I'll bring the level down on Oscillator 3 here and just compare oscillator 1 and 2 together. The fine-tune slider is helpful for this. Currently we're using the normal connection, so we're getting the pulse waveform out of both VCOs here. So the pulse width sliders will work, but we can always patch in any of the other waveforms if we wanted to. Alright, let's bring in oscillator 3 in here and also tune it. So now we're getting this nice detuned, rich, chorusy-like sound. So this is the initial filter frequency. So that was the newer design. Let's compare it with the latter design. Fine-tune control as well here, so just adjusting that cutoff frequency slightly. The 4072 design does have a higher maximum cutoff frequency, but just comparing between the two, it's really hard to tell the difference. Now we haven't brought in resonance. Let's compare it with resonance up. Alright, so I'm just going to leave that to you all to decide how different the two filter models sound. And also let's hear it through a musical pattern instead of a boring single note drone like this. Resonance all the way down. That's the VCA level going to the output. It's all the way up to the maximum. Let's maximize all these levels as well. We have another level control here, the signal going into the VCA. Let's bring in some of that resonance. You will notice a reduction in low frequencies as we increase the resonance, quite common for the ladder design. So right now the VCA is being controlled by the AR envelope, which is over here, attack and release. We also have an ADSR envelope, and that is modulating the filter frequency. And this is the amount of modulation over here. Another feature unique to the Behringer 2600 is the time factor for this ADSR envelope. So you can bring it down to 0.5. So it's going to be a much tighter envelope here. Let's set it back to ×1, so that's the original length. I'll keep switching out the filter type so you can notice the difference there. You can also make this time factor ×2, so now the envelope is twice as long. I like that the filter is labeled a resonator here, so that tells us that if there's no signal going into the filter, and if the resonance is all the way up, we will hear a sine wave tone because the filter is self-resonating. A bit of a disappointment with the reverb here. It's not an actual spring unit, it's a digital emulation. But when the sliders are all the way down, we get a purely analog path. And when these sliders are up, we're just mixing in that digital reverb effect. Not having an actual spring reverb makes the overall unit a bit lighter. But I wish there was a bit more control over this reverb, instead of just level control like this. Since it is a digital unit, they could have given us a bit more, maybe modulation possibilities, I don't know. Anyway, moving along. Next, let's check out the noise generator. I'll mix this in with the other sound sources we have running going into the filter. Bring the resonance down. I have this melodic pattern running in. Alright, now let's bring in the noise. It has a level control here, but there's also a level control that's going into the filter. So I'll set this at maximum. So let's bring everything down and just hear the noise for now. So now this is at the lowest, so filtered noise. We can bring it up to the middle here to get pink noise. And when it's all the way up, we get something that's close to white noise. Mixing the noise in with the oscillator signals. Later on in this video, I'm going to show you another very interesting way to introduce noise using this 2600. Now this is a semi-modular synthesizer, so you can do a lot of fun things with patching. There's a ring modulation unit here, so that's taking the signal from VCO1 and VCO2, multiplying it, and that's going into the filter on this slider here, the normal connection that is. We've already checked out the noise unit. There's this voltage processor section. We can use this bottom one here to introduce lag for like Portamento style effects, though we already have a Portamento feature built in over here. There's sample and hold. And then there's this thing called the electronic switcher, which is rarely used. So let me give you an example of how this would be used. So what this essentially does is alternates between two signals, and it's using the sample and holds clock to adjust the rate of switching between the two signals. So feed two signals in the A and B inputs, and you will get one of them on the output of C here. So I'll switch this second oscillator to low frequency mode. We're going to use it as a low frequency oscillator. And I'm going to take the triangle output here and plug that into input A on this electronic switcher. All right. We have another dedicated LFO. Let's use that as well. So it is normal to create a vibrato effect in the sound, but we also have dedicated LFO output, so we can use that for anything else. So let's take the pulse LFO output here and plug that into the B input on the switcher. And now let's take the output from C and plug it in over here, so this will modulate the filter frequency. Alright, so right now, if you were to hear the signal without this modulation, this is what we have right now. The ADSR is modulating the filter frequency. I'm going to bring down the level on VCO2 here because we're not using that as an audio rate oscillator. It's being used as an LFO. And now let's bring in this electronic switcher modulation into play. And now you can see when the switch is on A, it's using the oscillator 2. And when it switches to B, it uses this LFO. So we essentially have an alternating modulation source going in to modulate the filter frequency. I can speed up the rate of switching with the rate on the sample and hold clock. So now we're switching faster between these two LFOs, which is affecting the filter frequency. Alright, let's now talk about the built-in Portamento feature we have here. So any notes coming in via MIDI can have this automatic Portamento effect. This is the glide time. There's a switch to turn it on and off. There's also a momentary switch if you want to control the effect in real time. Let's turn it off right now and just listen to the sound without Portamento. I'll turn it on, increase the glide time, and you can hear the gliding effect. We can turn it off, set the glide time, and activate the Portamento just by tapping this button here. So it's like a momentary switch. You can also do this via foot switch, and there's a jack for that at the back of the unit. All right, now let's test out some of the keyboard capabilities that we get on the 2600. We already talked about Portamento. Let's take a look at the vibrato effect we get with this LFO here. So I have the keyboard already patched in. So that's working fine. We have the LFO speed control here. Nothing's going to happen yet because we need to bring up the vibrato depth. And now you can hear vibrato in those notes. There's a pretty cool delay effect. So the onset of the vibrato can be delayed. But you'll notice that even up to the halfway point, there's not much of a delay. Once you cross that halfway point, then you start to hear the delay. The scaling is a bit weird on this slider. I feel like now it's just a bit too much. Like it's taking forever to kick in now. But you can play around with the slider and find the ideal level there. Alternatively, you can also just manually control it, kind of like a pitch bend wheel or a mod wheel. But as I said earlier, there is no actual CC control or mod wheel control. Pitch bend does work. So you can see here I'm bending the pitch. We don't have any control over it. It's just fixed at 2 semitones up and 2 semitones below. Alright, next let's talk about some of the modes here. We have a trigger mode option. So think of it like legato playing. When the trigger mode is set to mult, it'll always re-trigger envelopes. So every time I play a new note, the envelope re-triggers or starts again from the beginning. But if I set it to single, you can see here the envelopes do not re-trigger. So you get that legato effect if you play legato. Alright, so that's the legato feature. Next is this pretty handy repeat feature. So if I set it to auto, the notes just automatically repeat. It is repeating at the rate of the LFO. Or it can be switched to keyboard mode. So we don't hear any re-trigger until we hold down a note, and then it re-triggers. So that could be useful. Alright, now let's talk about the duophonic mode. So yes, we have a duo mode, meaning you can play 2 notes simultaneously. But when you switch this on, you'll notice that it doesn't immediately work, because there is some patching required to make this work. In fact, it even might act a bit weird. You can see here I'm playing different notes, but the pitch is not quite changing, especially when playing legato. So mono works fine. But in duo mode, you can hear that it's not quite switching pitch correctly. Alright, so how does it exactly work? We have a separate patch point here called upper voice. So we need to patch that in to control the pitch of the second oscillator. So I'll patch that to the keyboard CV input on the second oscillator. And now let's try this again. And now as you can hear, we're getting 2 separate notes. The first oscillator is playing the lower note, and the higher note is going to the second oscillator, and we're getting this duophonic style mode. Now it's only the oscillator pitch that's changing, everything else is still monophonic. So the envelope, the entire voice essentially is still monophonic. Pretty cool. Alright, one last thing I want to show you is this envelope follower section. It has a preamp attached to it. So how envelope followers work is that you feed it some external signal, it'll create a control voltage signal based on that incoming signal, and then you can use that to modulate whatever. But we're not going to do that. I just want to use the preamp by itself. So we can just use the preamp to add additional gain to any signal. So let's take the output from the filter here and plug it into the input on this preamp. And then with another cable, I'll take the output of the preamp and plug that back into the VCA. So it's still the same signal. We just have one additional control here with the gain on the preamp. I'll bring the level up. I'm not hearing anything yet because the preamp over here is all the way down. So let's increase this now. I'll bring the reverb down so we'll hear the sound clean. So that sounds pretty much the same. But if I gradually increase the gain, you will notice that the signal will start to distort. I'll bring the main level down here so we don't clip. Not bad. Very subtle, overdriven style tone we're getting here. There's a range option here which is set to times 10. Let's go for times 100. So we're basically getting a lot more gain now. And now we're really distorting the signal. And then there's also times 1000. So this adds the maximum amount of gain. As you can hear, it does affect the tonal character of the sound a lot. I'm going to bring down the level of the oscillators going into the filter. And what you're hearing here is just a noise inherent in this preamp. So that's pretty cool. Pure analog noise. Alright, so that is the Behringer 2600 here. I hope you enjoyed this review. You can see here it's a pretty intense synthesizer, a lot of capabilities, and if you've ever used or even heard of the ARP 2600 in its actual physical form or emulation plugins, you know that it's a fantastic synthesizer, and this Behringer 2600 gives you a very similar experience but at a much lower price point. Alright, that's it for me. This is Rishabh Rajan signing off for Ask.Audio. Let me know your thoughts on this synthesizer in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.